Crisis Core Final Fantasy Reunion starts with us following Zack, a second-class Mako-enhanced super soldier working for the Shinra Corporation 7 years before the events of Final Fantasy VII, which is the most powerful organization and government in the world. After failing a training mission, Zack's mentor, first-class soldier Angeal, calls him into a meeting with the director of Soldier Lazard. In this meeting, Zack is asked if he knows the whereabouts of another first-class soldier, Genesis, who is missing in action, and Zack doesn't. After this, Zack is informed that he will replace Genesis on an upcoming mission to Wutai to end the war. Wutai is the second biggest superpower within the world of Final Fantasy VII and has been at war with Shinra for nearly a decade at this point. On top of this, Zack is informed that Angeal has recommended him for first class. Later on, Angeal and Zack travel to Fort Tamblin in Wutai. During this mission, Zack learns why Angeal rarely uses the Buster Sword, runs into a young Yuffie, and then completes his task. However, after finishing the mission, Angeal and Zack meet up with Lazard, but unfortunately they're attacked by a group of Genesis copies. These copies are second and third class soldiers who have been injected with Genesis cells and deserted Shinra to follow the former first class soldier. In addition, Angeal disappears in the chaos of the situation. Following this, Sephiroth appears, believing that Genesis and Angeal have betrayed the Shinra Corporation. After this, a month passes and Zack is assigned to investigate Banora, Genesis and Angeal's hometown. But he won't go alone, as Sang of the Turks will accompany him. The Turks are a group of highly trained individuals who handle covert operations and dirty work for the Shinra Corporation. As Zack investigates, he finds out that Angeal and Genesis were best friends growing up. Then he meets Angeal's mother. She explains that a month ago, Genesis with his copies came back to town and killed most of the townspeople, and Angeal came. After this, Sang calls Zack to a factory on the outskirts of town, and they figure out this is where the Genesis copies are being made. Then, as Zack and Sang go deeper into the factory, they encounter Genesis, but before they can attack them, Angeal steps in to save our heroes. Genesis leaves, and Angeal seems to be against Genesis but doesn't want to return to Soldier either. Zack tries to catch up, but he loses them. Following this, an airstrike is called to erase any evidence of Shinra's involvement at Banora. So Zack catches up with the two former first-class soldiers, only to find out that Angeal's mother is dead. Then Angeal states that neither he nor his mother can continue living in this world. After this, Genesis grows a wing and flies away as Banora is bombed. Following this, Zack returns to Midgar and the war with Wutai is officially over. So Zack is called into a meeting with Sephiroth and Lazard where he is promoted to first class. Following this, Genesis copies attack the Shinra building, and after Zack defeats them, Sephiroth appears and explains that these copies were created by Hollander, a former Shinra scientist who lost control of the science division in a competition with Hojo over who could produce the better results from the Genova project. Hojo's Project S succeeded and Hollander's Project G failed, so he hated the Shinra Corporation ever since. Sephiroth also assumes that Genesis and Hollander are working together at this point. Following this, Zack heads to Sector 8 to deal with more enemies, and this is where he meets Reno, Rude, and Sisane of the Turks. After securing Sector 8, Zack meets Sephiroth at Mako Reactor 5, hoping to find Angeal and Genesis before the army does. Unfortunately, along the way they find an Angeal copy which confirms that the two former first-class soldiers are working with Hollander. Then the game cuts to a flashback showing Genesis sustaining an injury while training with Angeal and Sephiroth. But it wasn't healing, so Dr. Hollander asked Angeal for a transfusion because Sephiroth wasn't a viable donor. Then the game cuts back to Sephiroth explaining this to Zack, and then Sephiroth reveals that Genesis is the result of Project G, which tried to create superhuman warriors by infusing human subjects with the cells of an alien named Genova. Hollander appears and reveals that Genesis and Angeal are slowly degrading due to the side effects of Project G, and that he's keeping them alive. After this, Zack chases Hollander but is stopped by Angeal and falls into the sector Sector 5 slums where he meets Aerith. During their encounter, he gives her the idea of selling flowers and buys her iconic bow. After this detour, Zack fights his way back to the Shinra building, but along the way he encounters Angeal, who asks for help to stop Genesis and Hollander. After agreeing to team up, our duo stops Genesis from killing Hojo for Hollander. After this, Genesis summons Fury Bahamut, so Zack deals with the summon while Angeal fights Genesis. After things calm down, Angeal returns to inform Soldier that Genesis and Hollander are in Modeoheim. This leads to Zack, Sang, and a couple of entrymen to follow them. Unfortunately, as they get close to their destination, their helicopter is shot, meaning that they have to walk the last leg to Modeoheim. During this walk, one infantryman introduces himself as Cloud. As they continue forward, they eventually find a Mako excavation site guarded by Genesis copies, so the group eventually continues forward, stopping Genesis just before he kills Hollander. Then Genesis states that he'll find Genova cells to stop his degradation, and if not, he'll take the entire world with him. At this point, Cloud chases Hollander while Zack fights Genesis. After being defeated, Genesis seemingly kills himself, so following this, Zack pursues Hollander as well, which leads him to Angeal. Then they have a conversation where it's revealed that Angeal's mother Jillian killed herself over her guilt for being a part of Project G. In addition to this, Angeal was also a subject of Project G, but the difference between him and Genesis is that Genesis was injected with Jillian's altered Genova cells as a fetus, while Angeal was born naturally without any side effects. This truth makes Angeal believe that he's a monster, so Angeal forces Zack to fight him to end his suffering. After the fight, Angeal thanks Zack for defeating him and gives him the Buster Sword. After this, a 2-year time skip happens where Zack hands over Hollander to Shinra, his distrust of the Shinra Corporation grows, and he starts getting followed around by the Turks all of the time, under the guise of their vacations overlapping, and is questioning why he's still in Soldier anymore. During Zack's most recent vacation, Cicene reveals that Aerith is the last ancient on the planet and that Director Lazard is missing, but before our hero can think about that, he's attacked by a group of Genesis copies. After this confrontation, Zack and the Turks are sent to Junon because it is under attack from an unknown force. After arriving, Sang informs Zack that Hollander is being held within Junon and asks Zack to secure the scientist. Unfortunately, Hollander gets loose, leading to Zack having to chase the man until the scientist is eventually carried away by some Genesis copies. After this, Sephiroth appears, explaining that Genesis copies have been seen all over the world, including Midgar. Then the game cuts to Genesis giving another nonsensical monologue to nobody, revealing that he is alive. Then the game cuts back to Zack checking on Aerith after hearing about Genesis copies in Midgar. But when Zack arrives, he finds a degrading Angeal copy protecting her. Following this encounter, Zack finally builds Aerith a flower cart. Later on, Zack is called back to Shinra headquarters where Sephiroth informs him that monsters are popping up around the Nibelheim Mako reactor. Sephiroth continues to explain the threads between Genesis, Hollander, and Lazard all seem to be pointing to the reactor in Nibelheim, and depending on what he finds there, he may desert Shinra. Following this, Zack tells Aerith goodbye and asks Sang to look out for her while he's gone. Then the first class soldier and Cloud, who has been assigned to this mission, head to Nibelheim, which is Cloud's hometown. After a night's rest, our trio is led to the reactor by Cloud's childhood friend, Tifa, but the only two allowed inside are Sephiroth and Zack. Upon entering the reactor, our duo finds a sealed door labeled Genova and some of the test subjects of Project S, which was led by Professor Hojo. This leads Sephiroth to figure out that he is the end result of this project and starts questioning if he's even human. Following this, Genesis appears and confirms to Sephiroth that his mother Genova was extracted from a 2,000-year-old fossil and that he is the perfect result from the experiments with her cells. Then Genesis explains that while Angeal and his cells can degrade, Sephiroth's cells don't. So Genesis asks Sephiroth to share his cells with him so he can survive. but Sephiroth abandons him to his fate. After this, Zack helps an injured Cloud and Tifa back to Nibelheim. Following this, Zack finds a disturbed Sephiroth in the basement of the Shinra Manor and is told to leave. Then over the next week, Sephiroth reviews all of the information in the basement about the Genova project, leading to his complete mental breakdown, driving him insane. This leads Sephiroth to go on a killing spree in Nibelheim, making his way back to the reactor to take his mother. Sephiroth now believes that he and his mother should rule over the planet because he now sees humans as inferior and will do anything to accomplish his goal of world domination. Following this, Zack fights Sephiroth, but he loses. However, Cloud appears and manages to sneak up on Sephiroth, dealing a devastating blow, and throws Sephiroth down the shaft he just fought Zack in. Unfortunately, Zack and Cloud are both seriously injured, but they're saved by Professor Hojo. Zack wakes up after 4 years and also breaks Cloud out of his pod as well. Unfortunately, the experiments and Mako poisoning have taken their toll on Cloud, leaving him catatonic. After gathering his thoughts, Zack decides to head back to Midgard because he's worried about Aerith and drags Cloud with him. They eventually run into Cicene, who explains that not only is the Shinra army after them, but the Turks as well. But fortunately for our heroes, she lets them go and gives them a motorcycle. As they're traveling, Genesis attacks our duo, explaining that he believes that their modified cells will be the cure to healing him, and leaves. A small side note here, S cells have never been explained within the Final Fantasy VII franchise, but it is safe to assume that they're cells taken from Sephiroth when he was young or altered Genova cells. Then our duo heads back to Zack's hometown, Gongaga, but Cicene is there as well, so she informs Zack that his parents are doing well and that there have been Angeal sightings. Zack then asks Cicene to look out for his parents and she agrees to. Then Zack follows someone who looks like Angeal but can't catch them. However, this is when Genesis and a degrading Hollander who has become a Genesis copy appear. Then Hollander explains that he believes the last pure S cells are within Cloud and attempts to capture him. But a degrading Angeal copy appears and stops the scientists, giving Zack enough time to get past Genesis and finish Hollander once and for all. After the battle, the Angeal copy reveals that he's Lazard and that this was his punishment for going against Shinra by freeing Hollander at Junon. Then Lazard explains that he doesn't care about revenge against Shinra anymore, simply wanting to help Zack, Genesis, and maybe even save the world. After this, Zack and Lazard track Genesis to Benora. Then Zack finds Genesis within the Benora ruins. Zack attempts to talk Genesis down, but his words fall on deaf ears and Genesis transforms into Genesis' avatar. After the fight, Genesis seems to be healed. Then Genesis quotes a Loveless passage about a soul corrupted by vengeance, the torment endured on his journey to find salvation, and an eternal slumber, referring to himself. This leads Zack to figure out that Genesis figured out how to heal himself a while ago. This leads to a second fight where Genesis wants to beat Zack to complete the play and meet the goddess, but he loses. However, while Genesis was unconscious, he enters the life stream and meets the goddess Minerva before she sends him back to Gaia to continue living. Following this, Zack carries Genesis out of the Benora ruins, only to find out that Cloud and Lazard were attacked by Shinra but were protected by the Angeal copy that was watching over Aerith. Then Lazard and the other Angeal copy pass away, but Zack finds a letter from Aerith on the other Angeal copy where he finds out that he was stuck in Nibelheim for 4 years. After this, Zack picks up Cloud and continues to Midgard. However, the game sticks with Genesis and he's recovered by Vice and Nero for unknown planes within the Shinra company. Following this, the game cuts to Sang ordering the Turks to find Zack and Cloud before the army finds them to save our heroes. Unfortunately, the Turks are too late and Zack makes his final stand just outside of Midgard, leading to his defeat. But before Zack passes away, Cloud is in a very confused mental state and crawls back to Zack, receiving the Buster Sword and imprints Zack's history onto himself, leading Cloud to believe that he is a first-class soldier. At this point, a month passes and Final Fantasy VII Remake starts with a mercenary named Cloud working with a branch of Avalanche to bomb a Mako reactor within Midgar. Avalanche is an eco-terrorist group that wants to stop the evil corporation of Shinra from sucking the planet dry of its life energy, which is Mako. As the mission continues, Cloud gets acquainted with the members of Avalanche, Biggs, Jesse, Wedge, and their leader Barret. As they make their way to the reactor, the game shows us that Shinra's president and head of military is watching Cloud and the others. After our heroes plant the bomb, they leave, but the bomb doesn't go off, so the Shinra Corporation blows up the reactor themselves for an unknown reason. Following this, Cloud and Avalanche split up so they can get back to the Sector 7 slums. As Cloud makes his way, he sees hallucinations of Sephiroth and his hometown on fire. Then Cloud runs into a flower girl that is fighting off some dark creatures, but eventually she runs away and Cloud gets to the Sector 7 slums with Avalanche, where he reunites with his childhood friend Tifa, who is a part of Avalanche, and meets Barret's daughter Marlene. Following this, Tifa takes Cloud to his apartment and tells him that she'll get Cloud his money tomorrow. After this, Cloud goes to sleep but is woken up by a noise in the apartment next to him and is attacked by Sephiroth, but when Cloud tries to kill him, he is stopped by Tifa, and when Cloud looks back, he sees a man in a black robe named Marco. In the morning, Cloud goes around with Tifa to get the rest of his money. Eventually, Avalanche has a meeting. After waiting, they tell Cloud that they won't need him for their next mission. Then Cloud goes out by himself and fights some of Don Corneo's thugs that are looking for Barret. After the fight, he goes back to his apartment where Jesse asks for his help with a job and Cloud agrees. So later on that night, Cloud, Jesse, in addition to Biggs and Wedge who tagged along, go to the Sector 7 plate, which is above the slums. But before they get there, they run into a soldier named Roche, but Cloud deals with him and they continue forward. Side note here, Cloud and Roche are soldiers, meaning that they've had their physical abilities enhanced by Mako. So getting back to the story, our heroes go to Jesse's parents' house to steal her father's ID so Jesse can sneak into a Shinra warehouse for bomb supplies. So Cloud, Biggs, and Wedge distract the guards to help her. During their distraction, Cloud has to fight Roche again and wins. Following this, our group is almost overwhelmed by Shinra, but they're bailed out by the proper Avalanche organization and get home safely. Side note here, Barret's branch of Avalanche was labeled as an extremist group, so they've been ostracized from the main organization, and the main Avalanche organization might be working with Wutai, another nation on the planet of Final Fantasy VII. The next morning, Cloud is woken up by Tifa to find that the dark creatures are all over the slums. So Tifa and Cloud fight their way to Barret's bar to regroup with everyone, but Jesse gets injured. So Cloud takes her place to help Tifa and Barret to bomb the next reactor. They get to the next reactor with no problem, even though Shinra's head of military Heidegger is watching them. After planting the bomb, Heidegger reveals that he has been watching them and that Shinra is using the news to make the public hate Avalanche, on top of forcing our heroes to fight the Airbuster, which was designed to fight giant monsters. So our heroes make their way to the facility, but before they fight Airbuster, they talk to President Shinra and Heidegger, who explains that they were just pawns to garner public support for a war with Wutai. Following this, our heroes defeat the Airbuster, but Cloud falls into the Sector 5 slums while Barret and Tifa go back to Sector 7. Then Cloud has a dream where it seems like he's talking to Sephiroth directly, but when Cloud wakes up, he meets the flower girl again and her name is Aerith. Then a Turk named Reno, who seems to know Aerith, appears and tries to capture her, but Cloud fights him off. Side note here, the Turks are a department within Shinra that does the company's dirty work. Getting back to the story, Cloud tries to finish off Reno, but the dark creatures stop him. Then Aerith and Cloud escape, but as they leave, the dark creatures help them. After this, Aerith shows Cloud around the Sector 5 slums and her house, where Cloud meets Aerith's mother, Elmira. Following this, Cloud helps Aerith save some kids from a river, but when they get back to town, Cloud sees a hooded man. But for a split second, Cloud sees the man as Sephiroth. However, Aerith calms him down and they head back to her house, until they're stopped by another Turk who knows Aerith named Rude. He's Reno's partner and wants some payback. But before their fight gets serious, Rude gets a call and leaves. After this, our duo goes back to Aerith's house to have dinner, but Elmira asks Cloud to leave while Aerith sleeps later that night. So Cloud leaves, but Aerith sneaks out to show him the way to Sector 7. But before they split up, Aerith tells Cloud that her first love was a soldier like him and that his name was Zack. But while they're talking, Tifa passes by in a chocobo carriage heading for Don Corneo's house to be his bride. Our duo decides to help Tifa by getting invited to be brides as well. This adventure leads them to fight the Hell House, encountering Don Corneo's lackeys like Leslie and Cloud dressing like a woman. This leads them to Don Corneo's house, where they unite with Tifa, and after getting some help from Leslie, they confront Don Corneo about why he was looking for Barret. So Corneo explains that Heidegger asked him to find Barret and that Shinra is going to drop the Sector 7 plate, killing everyone on the plate and below, which is around 50,000 people. Following this, Corneo opens up a trapdoor that sends our trio into the sewers. Then the game cuts to another Shinra executive named Reeve begging the president and Heidegger to reconsider their plans about Sector 7. Then the game moves back to our trio, who fights their way through the sewers and the train graveyard to Sector 7. But as they get closer, Barret and his branch of Avalanche got the information about what Shinra is trying to do in Sector 7. So they're fighting the Turks and Shinra grunts. But getting back to Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith, they arrive at Sector 7. However, they have to fight some more dark creatures. But after getting past them, they get to the pillar where Wedge has fallen off. After checking on Wedge, Cloud goes up the pillar to help. Tifa asks Aerith to get Marlene, and Tifa goes after Cloud. At this point, the story splits, so let's follow Aerith first. Wedge gives Aerith directions to 7th Heaven and leaves to help people get to safety. Following this, Aerith finds Marlene in the bar and uses a mysterious power to calm the child down. Unfortunately, before they can leave, another Turk named Sang appears, so Aerith makes a deal with him and the two girls go with Sang. Getting back to the pillar, Cloud fights his way up until he runs into Biggs just as he passes away. Then Cloud is joined by Tifa and the two of them find Jessie to hear her final words as she passes away. After this, Tifa and Cloud regroup with Barret and they fight Rude and Reno. Our heroes win the fight, but the Turks activate the plate drop. So before our heroes escape, Sang calls the pillar to taunt them and they find out that Aerith exchanged her freedom to save Marlene and that Aerith is something called an ancient. After this, our trio escapes Sector 7 and heads towards Aerith's house. But along the way, Cloud sees a hallucination of Sephiroth calling himself an ancient, and Barret explains that the ancients were the original stewards of the planet. Then they reach Aerith's house where they see Marlene sleeping and they talk to Elmira, who explains that Aerith is the last ancient on the planet and that Shinra wants her to lead them to a promised land filled with Mako. Following this, Barret, Cloud, and Tifa go back to Sector 7 to see if anyone needs help. They eventually find Wedge in an underground Shinra laboratory and defeat waves of experiments. After their fight, they take Wedge back to Aerith's house. Barret is informed about Biggs and Jessie's deaths and they tell Elmira that they're going to save Aerith tomorrow. Then everyone rests for the night. In the morning, Barret says bye to Marlene, leaving her with Elmira. Then our trio makes a deal with Leslie to get to the Shinra building. But as they're in the sewers, a monster steals something from Leslie. When our heroes catch the monster, they find out that it was a pendant that Leslie gave to his fiance. So Leslie explains that Don Corneo chose his fiance as a wife, so she ran away and gave the pendant back. Then Leslie says that he wants to kill Corneo for revenge and has has nothing else to live for. But Tifa theorizes that Leslie's fiance wants him to find her. After this, they reach Corneo, where he reveals that he was working with Shinra because they wanted him to control a new wall market in Neo Midgar, a city that they'll build on the Promised Land, on top of saying that Shinra is going to abandon Midgar, which is why they dropped the plate and don't care about the reactors blowing up. Following this, Corneo gets the upper hand on Leslie and runs away. Then our heroes defeat Corneo's pet, and Leslie gives them grappling guns to get to the Shinra building. Then he leaves to find his fiance. After this, our heroes climb through the wreckage until they get to the Shinra building. As they climb up the tower, they enter a VR room that talks about the ancients in a more palatable way for the public. But the VR presentation goes wrong, showing visions of a meteor and Sephiroth. Then the game cuts to a Shinra executive named Palmer seeing Sephiroth in the building, which explains the VR presentation. After this, they meet the mayor of Midgar, who explains that he's a mole for Avalanche, which explains why they haven't been constantly fighting security, and gives them a key card to floor 64. Following this, our trio spies on a meeting between Shinra executives, finding out that Aerith is in Hojo's lab, but Hojo releases one of his experiments, so our heroes fight and defeat it, eventually finding Aerith and freeing her frees Red 13 as well. Red 13 is initially hostile until Aerith uses a mysterious power to calm him down. But before our group can follow Hojo, Cloud starts having flashbacks calling some alien creature Mother and passes out. Then the game cuts to the Turks, where Reno and Rude are regretting their actions, on top of saying talking to the Shinra vice president. But getting back to the main characters, Cloud wakes up and Aerith explains that she doesn't know where the Promised Land is. Then the dark creatures appear and Red 13 calls them Whispers, saying that they are drawn to people who try to change destiny, which explains why they always appear when our characters do something different from the original Final Fantasy VII. Then Wedge calls our heroes and tells them Avalanche is going to send a helicopter to extract them, but they have to go through Hojo's laboratory to get to the roof. But when they enter Hojo's laboratory, a couple of things happen. They find the alien creature Cloud remembered, and Aerith calls it Genova. Then Cloud remembers a lot of things at one time. Then Sephiroth actually appears and takes Genova. Following this, our heroes go through some trials fighting some of Hojo's experiments until they get out of the lab and reach the top of the building, where they find President Shinra hanging off the edge. After saving him, Barret demands that he tells the public the truth about everything, but Sephiroth kills him and stabs Barret. Then Genova Dreamweaver appears, so everyone except Barret fights her. Then Sephiroth comes back to take Genova away. Following this, Barret is saved by the Whispers because he isn't supposed to die, and Cloud goes outside to stop Sephiroth, but it's one of the hooded men. Then the Avalanche helicopter is shot down by the Turks and Rufus Shinra, the vice president and son of President Shinra. So Cloud holds off Rufus so the others can escape and almost falls off the building, but Tifa comes back to save him. Then the game cuts to Wedge being dragged to his death by the Whispers. Then this game moves to Aerith, Barret, and Red 13 defeating a machine and trying to leave the building. Unfortunately, they're stopped by Heidegger and his lackeys. However, Tifa and Cloud find some transportation, so they rescue their friends and they all leave. But as they drive away, the Whispers are surrounding Shinra HQ, stopping anyone from following our heroes. After a little trouble, everyone makes it to the end of the highway where the real Sephiroth is waiting for them. Big side note here, there are 4 versions of Sephiroth in this game. Number 1 is an illusion only Cloud can see. Number 2 is the black hooded men that look like Sephiroth. Number 3 is a flashback version that Cloud sees. Lastly, number 4 is an unknown existence that Cloud and the others perceive as Sephiroth, which is standing in front of our heroes right now. But getting back to the game, it cuts to Zack's final stand just before the events of Final Fantasy VII. Then the game goes back to our heroes and Sephiroth, Sephiroth. Following this, Sephiroth opens a portal and walks through it, but before our heroes go after him, Aerith tells them that Sephiroth has to be stopped right now, and warns them that if they do this, they'll change fate and themselves, which is the game's way of telling the players that there might be serious changes to the story of Final Fantasy VII from this point forward. So after hearing this, they go after Sephiroth, but before that, they fight some super strong whispers, and during that fight, they get flashbacks to the original Final Fantasy VII timeline, seeing things like Meteor, Aerith's death, and Cloud fighting Sephiroth in Advent Children. Then they move on to fight Sephiroth and they win. But this was a part of Sephiroth's plan, because now that the whispers have been destroyed, he can do whatever he wants now as well. But Sephiroth isn't done, because he brings Cloud to the edge of existence and asks Cloud to defy fate with him. Cloud refuses and attacks him. However, Sephiroth blocks every attack. Then he taunts Cloud by asking what will he do in the final 7 seconds, referencing Meteor hitting the planet. Then the game jumps to a couple of different scenes where Rufus becomes the president of Shinra, Zack surviving his final stand, showing the side effects of killing the Whispers, on top of Biggs and possibly Jesse being alive as well. Then we get to the final scene of the game where Cloud, Barret, Tifa, Aerith, and Red 13 leave Midgar to chase Sephiroth. At the same time, we see Zack and Cloud entering Midgar, meaning that Zack might be in a different timeline than the other characters. Final Fantasy VII Intermission starts with Yuffie entering Midgar so she can work with Avalanche. As she gets closer to the Sector 7 slums, she runs into a couple of black-robed men, but she ignores them. Then Yuffie arrives at the slums where she meets her point of contact, ZJ, who takes her to the proper Avalanche hideout, where she's introduced to Billy Bob, Polk, and Nio. Side note here, these people work with the proper Avalanche organization, not Barrett's branch. But getting back to the game, Yuffie introduces herself as a materia hunter and elite special forces operative for the new Wutai government, or just a ninja to make it short. And we find out her mission is to sneak into Shinra's headquarters to steal their ultimate materia. After some time passes, Yuffie's partner Sonon appears after doing some recon. Following this, Yuffie and Sonon go with Nio to get their fake train IDs. However, along the way they see Barret and Tifa after fighting Airbuster. Side note here, this DLC takes place between Cloud falling into Sector 5 up to the Sector 7 plate drop in the original game. But getting back to the game, Tifa hears about Don Corneo looking for Barret, which leads to her trying to be his bride in the original game. After this, Yuffie and Sonon get their IDs. Unfortunately, when they return, ZJ is being chased by Shinra guards. So Nio goes back to inform the others, and the two ninjas chase ZJ. When they catch up, Yuffie distracts the guards and Sonon saves ZJ. Unfortunately, a giant machine is released, so our heroes fight it and win. After this, ZJ gives the ninjas their Shinra IDs and he leaves to tell the rest of Avalanche about Shinra trying to drop the Sector 7 plate, which explains how Barret was fighting Shinra when Cloud, Tifa, and Aerith got to Sector 7 in the original game. But getting back to the story, Yuffie and Sonon get on the train and everyone says goodbye and wishes them luck. As the two ninjas are on the train, Sonon reveals that he and his sister Melfi trained under Yuffie's father, and that his sister died protecting people from a Shinra machine, which explains his motivation for doing this. After this, the two ninjas get to Shinra headquarters where they end up in an elevator with a Shinra executive named Scarlet. Unfortunately, Scarlet discovers they're from Wutai and forces them to fight some of Shinra's advanced weapons. But before they start fighting, Sonon reveals that Scarlet created the weapon that killed his sister. So as the ninjas destroy the advanced weapons, they reach where they think the materia is, but it isn't. So Scarlet taunts them and forces the ninjas to fight more machines. This leads them to Scarlet and a prototype the scientist wants to test out. After a brutal fight, Scarlet triggers an alarm to Deep Ground, a top secret military branch within Shinra, and they release Nero to deal with Yuffie and Sonon. But before Nero makes his way up, he talks to Vice about the scientist making a virtual copy of him. Side note here, if you want to know more about Deep Ground, Vice, or Nero, play Dirge of Cerberus, the original game they were introduced in. But getting back to the game, our heroes capture Scarlet and she reveals that Shinra has been trying to create a very powerful materia, but it hasn't been created yet. Following this, some Deep Ground soldiers arrive to corner Yuffie and Sonon in a VR room. Unfortunately, Scarlet programs the room to create a monster similar to Genova, which our heroes fight, and she orders Nero to kill the ninjas when they leave the room. Unfortunately, when Yuffie and Sonon escape the VR room, they run into Nero and have an extremely tough fight, but they win. However, Nero isn't dead, so he tries to attack Yuffie, but Sonon takes the fatal blow to save her life. Then Sonon pushes Yuffie out the door so she can escape. Then the game stays with Sonon, who sees a hallucination of his sister as he passes away. However, Nero doesn't consume his body like the other people on this floor, meaning that we might see Sonon again later on down the line. Then the game cuts to Yuffie escaping Shinra headquarters just as the Sector 7 plate collapses. Then the game cuts to Yuffie realizing that she can't defeat Shinra alone, teasing her meeting everyone in Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. Then the game cuts to Cloud, Barret, Tifa, Aerith, and Red 13 entering the town of Calm. And lastly, we get a scene of Zack visiting Aerith at the church, but when he opens the door, all he sees are people crying, and he calls her name in a questioning manner. And that is the end of Final Fantasy VII Remake Intermission. With that being said, if you want to see more timeline videos like this one, or video essays on your favorite video games, like, comment, and subscribe with notifications turned on. But with that being said, it's been Skips and I'm out.